who else? Well, that's it.
Burt Lancaster was Hollywood royalty, a magnetic leading man whose career spanned 5 decades. To fans, he was the rugged hero, the bold rebel, the charismatic figure who could dominate the screen with just a glance. But behind the curtain, Lancaster carried grudges, and there was one man in particular he despised more than anyone else. This wasn't just professional rivalry. It was personal, bitter, and lasting. Their feud left scars on Lancaster's career and shaped the way he navigated Hollywood's golden age. For years, the truth was buried beneath studio gloss, but now stories from co-stars, directors, and insiders finally reveal why Burt Lancaster's hatred burned so fiercely, and who truly earned his wrath. Burt Lancaster's rise in Hollywood was unlike that of most of his peers. Born in 1913 in East Harlem, New York, Lancaster grew up in a working-class environment, the son of a postal worker. What set him apart early in life was his extraordinary athleticism and charisma. Before ever stepping foot into a film studio, he was already living a life filled with adventure. He joined the circus as an acrobat, dazzling audiences with his strength and fearlessness, which helped him build not only his reputation, but also the kind of physical presence that later became his signature on screen. Unlike many actors who spent years struggling in theater before transitioning to film, Lancaster's unique background gave him a certain mystique, a combination of ruggedness and grace, which captivated casting agents in the 1940s. His big break came in 1946 with The Killers, a noir classic that cemented his place in Hollywood practically overnight. The tall, striking figure of Lancaster, with his piercing eyes and commanding presence, made him impossible to ignore. Critics praised him as a new kind of leading man, someone who was not just handsome, but also brimming with intensity. Audiences, too, were enthralled. He could be both tender and ferocious, and this versatility gave him an edge in an industry that often pigeonholed actors. As Lancaster's career took off, he quickly gained a reputation not just for his talent, but also for his determination. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were content to simply perform, Lancaster had bigger ambitions. He co-founded Hecht Hill Lancaster, one of the most successful independent production companies of the 1950s, producing films like Marty, 1955, which went on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. This move showed his business acumen and desire to control his artistic destiny. Hollywood insiders admired him for this, but it also created friction. Lancaster was not the type to quietly follow the orders of studio executives or directors. He wanted things done his way, and his confidence often came across as arrogance. Behind the scenes, Lancaster was known as a man of strong convictions. He was outspoken about politics, civil rights, and social issues, rare for a Hollywood star of his time. He was one of the few actors who openly supported controversial causes, like racial integration and opposing the Vietnam War. While this earned him respect among progressives, it also won him enemies in both political and Hollywood circles. Lancaster didn't care. To him, authenticity mattered more than popularity, and he lived by that rule. But with success came tension. Hollywood is a place of fragile egos, and Lancaster's larger-than-life personality inevitably clashed with others. Though admired by millions of fans, there were those in the industry who despised him, not for lack of talent, but for his unwillingness to compromise. Among them was one figure in particular, someone who Lancaster grew to hate more than anyone else. Their rivalry would become one of Hollywood's most whispered-about feuds, hidden behind red carpet smiles but fueled by bitterness behind the scenes. By the early 1950s, Burt Lancaster was one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. His films, ranging from swashbuckling adventures to intense dramas, proved his versatility. Yet Hollywood has never been a place where dominance goes unchallenged. For every rising star, there are others fighting for the same spotlight, the same roles, and the same acclaim. Lancaster's confidence and refusal to play by the old studio rules rubbed many the wrong way, especially the older generation of actors who saw him as brash and uncompromising. One of the central figures who would become Lancaster's bitterest rival was Kirk Douglas. Both men shared a similar trajectory: tough backgrounds, strong physiques, and the ability to play morally complex characters. On paper, they should have been allies. In reality, they became locked in one of Hollywood's fiercest rivalries, one fueled by ego, competition, and a stubborn refusal to yield. The first time Lancaster and Douglas crossed paths was on the set of I Walk Alone, 1947. It was Douglas's third film, and Lancaster was already on the verge of superstardom. From the very beginning, sparks flew between the two, not the kind of sparks that lead to lifelong friendship, but the kind that ignite a lifelong grudge. Douglas, who was intensely ambitious and determined to prove himself, found Lancaster's natural charisma infuriating. Douglas had to claw his way into every role, using grit and persistence, while Lancaster seemed to command attention simply by walking into a room. Their competitive streaks only intensified as they often found themselves up for the same roles. When Lancaster landed From Here to Eternity, 1953, a film that won him widespread critical acclaim, Douglas reportedly fumed. He had wanted the role, and seeing it slip into Lancaster's hands stung deeply. Likewise, when Douglas triumphed with Spartacus, 1960, a film that made him an icon, Lancaster couldn't hide his disdain. To him, Douglas's performance was overly self-indulgent, an ego project more than a piece of art. Behind the scenes, their feud was infamous. Crew members who worked on films with either man often remarked how both actors would size each other up, competing in everything, from physical strength to who had the most lines of dialogue. During interviews, Douglas would often take subtle digs at Lancaster, calling him too theatrical, while Lancaster shot back by mocking Douglas's vanity and relentless hunger for fame. It wasn't just rivalry, it was hatred, raw and unfiltered. Part of the animosity also stemmed from personality differences. Lancaster was political, socially conscious, and always ready to argue for a cause. Douglas, by contrast, was pragmatic, ambitious, and laser-focused on his career. Lancaster often viewed Douglas as shallow, willing to compromise integrity for success. Douglas, in turn, saw Lancaster as self-righteous and infuriatingly smug. These clashes weren't occasional, they were constant. What made their feud all the more fascinating was that, on the surface, Hollywood tried to present them as a dynamic duo. Studios recognized the box office potential of pairing two strong personalities, so Lancaster and Douglas co-starred in several films together, including Gunfight at the OK Corral, 1957, The Devil's Disciple, 1959, and 7 Days in May, 1964. Their chemistry on screen was undeniable, but off-screen, it was fueled by real tension. Each scene became a battlefield, not just of dialogue, but of pride. Lancaster hated being upstaged, and Douglas loathed the idea of playing second fiddle. For Lancaster, of all the rivals and competitors he encountered throughout his career, no one got under his skin more than Kirk Douglas. It wasn't just professional jealousy, it was personal. Douglas embodied everything Lancaster despised in Hollywood: relentless ambition at any cost, vanity dressed up as artistry, and a hunger for fame that seemed to overshadow substance. And though the public loved to watch their collaborations, behind closed doors, Lancaster would admit to close friends that he utterly hated Douglas more than anyone else. By the 1960s, the rivalry between Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas was no longer a secret. It was one of Hollywood's worst-kept stories, an open feud that simmered beneath the surface of their collaborations and spilled over into the press. What made it so captivating was that both men were A-list giants, neither willing to step aside for the other. To fans, they were two sides of the same coin. To each other, they were enemies locked in a lifelong duel. Their most infamous collaboration, Gunfight at the OK Corral, 1957, is often cited as a textbook example of how their hatred translated into cinematic tension. On screen, Lancaster played Wyatt Earp with quiet authority, while Douglas's Doc Holliday was sharp-tongued, unpredictable, and volatile. The chemistry was electric, but insiders knew that what the audience saw wasn't just acting, it was their real emotions spilling into their characters. Every exchange of dialogue was charged with the bitterness of two men trying to dominate the scene. Crew members later recalled that Lancaster and Douglas rarely spoke off camera, and when they did, it was usually confrontational. Lancaster demanded respect as the leading man, while Douglas refused to play second fiddle. At one point, Lancaster allegedly told a producer that Douglas should remember who sells the tickets, while Douglas snapped back in interviews that Lancaster takes himself far too seriously. These jabs weren't harmless banter. They were public daggers meant to draw blood. Their differences extended far beyond the set. Lancaster had a reputation as a socially conscious actor, deeply involved in political causes and outspoken against Hollywood's conservative establishment. He campaigned for civil rights, opposed McCarthyism, and later criticized the Vietnam War. Douglas, while not apolitical, kept his activism secondary to his career. He was pragmatic. His energy went into building his empire as both an actor and producer. This contrast only deepened Lancaster's disdain, as he saw Douglas as someone too concerned with personal success and not enough with larger moral issues. One defining moment in their rivalry came during the production of 7 Days in May, 1964, a tense Cold War thriller. Both stars had equal billing, but the balance of power on set was anything but equal. Lancaster, cast as a scheming general, relished the complexity of the role and believed it showcased his dramatic depth. Douglas, playing a principled officer, saw himself as the moral core of the story. The competition over who carried the film was so intense that director John Frankenheimer often had to mediate between the two, ensuring neither man felt overshadowed. Behind the camera, both actors fought for control, insisting on input regarding script changes and camera angles. Ironically, this mutual hatred was also their selling point. Studios recognized that pairing Lancaster and Douglas guaranteed sparks, and sparks meant ticket sales. Audiences sensed the tension and flocked to see it unfold on screen. Hollywood cashed in on the feud, while the two men remained trapped in a cycle of cooperation and contempt. What made this feud so enduring was that it wasn't about one single incident. There wasn't a betrayal or a scandal that broke their relationship. Instead, it was a clash of egos, a battle of philosophies, and a stubborn refusal to concede ground. Lancaster saw Douglas as vain and egocentric. Douglas saw Lancaster as pompous and insufferable. Each man mirrored what the other despised about Hollywood, and in that mirror, they saw their own insecurities reflected back. By the time the 1970s arrived, both men were legends in their own right, but the feud had defined them. They were forever, linked in the public imagination, not just as co-stars, but as rivals. For Lancaster, his hatred of Douglas wasn't a fleeting grudge. It was the defining rivalry of his career, a shadow that followed him until the end of his life. As Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas entered the later decades of their careers, the fire that had fueled their rivalry began to burn differently. Age softened many of Hollywood's fiercest competitors, but for Lancaster and Douglas, the tension never entirely vanished. Even when they stood side by side at award ceremonies or appeared together in interviews, there was always an edge in their body language, a quiet reminder that neither had ever truly forgiven or forgotten. By the late 1970s and 1980s, both men had become revered elder statesmen of the film industry. Lancaster's performances in Atlantic City, 1980, and Local Hero, 1983, reminded audiences of his incredible range and maturity, while Douglas continued to thrive as both actor and producer, with projects like The Final Countdown, 1980, and his involvement in Hollywood's ongoing evolution. Yet even in their golden years, when careers were supposed to be winding down, comparisons between the two never stopped. Critics often wrote about them as if they were in a permanent duel. Who had the more memorable roles? Who aged more gracefully? Who had left the deeper mark on cinema? For Lancaster, This constant comparison only deepened the bitterness. Privately, he confided to friends that Douglas always needed the last word, a habit he found intolerable. Douglas, on the other hand, once described Lancaster as a man who wanted to be loved but couldn't help making enemies. Their words about each other captured the essence of their feud, not just hatred, but a fascination born out of rivalry. They despised each other, but in despising, they were also bound together. One fascinating aspect of their relationship was the strange mixture of contempt and respect. Douglas, for all his criticisms, admitted that Lancaster was one of the finest actors of their generation. Likewise, Lancaster, even while seething at Douglas's vanity, acknowledged his tireless work ethic and unshakable determination. In some ways, they were two lions in the same cage, each too proud to bow, but both unwilling to admit that the other's strength mirrored their own. Their feud also reflected something larger about Hollywood itself. The golden age of cinema was built on larger-than-life personalities, and Lancaster and Douglas embodied that era's intensity. They were men who thrived in competition, who used their hatred as fuel to push performances further. It's no coincidence that some of their best work happened when they shared the screen. Audiences could feel the tension, the unspoken war happening beneath the dialogue, and it made their films unforgettable. In the years leading up to Lancaster's death in 1994, the rivalry mellowed, though it never truly died. Reports suggest that while they were never close friends, there was a final measure of peace between them, an acknowledgement that their careers had been shaped in part by each other's presence. Douglas outlived him by more than 2 decades, and in later interviews, when asked about Lancaster, his responses carried less venom and more reflection. It was as if age had forced him to recognize that his greatest rival had also been his greatest counterpart. Ultimately, the story of Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas is not just about hatred. It's about two men whose egos, passions, and talents collided in a way that left an indelible mark on Hollywood. Lancaster may have claimed to hate Douglas more than anyone, but without that rivalry, his career, and perhaps Douglas's as well, might not have burned as brightly. Their feud became part of their legend, a reminder that in Hollywood, even hatred can create greatness.